Hi, I'm Josh, and as always, I am very grateful to you for spending some of your valuable time with me as I talk about another book. This one is Neil Gaiman's The Ocean at the End of the Lane. Now, my history with Neil Gaiman has been fairly spotty. I originally read Neverwhere many years ago, and I remember thinking it was okay, but I didn't feel like it lived up to the hype that I had been hearing about at the time. And sometime after that, several years ago still, I read American Gods. And again, I thought it was a book that was okay, but nothing that really excited me too much. Next up, I read The Graveyard Book in 2 volumes. It was a graphic novel form that I read that book in, and I really quite enjoyed that one. I enjoyed the graphic novel format. I thought it was a cool story. So that's one that I enjoyed a fair bit. So overall, I wasn't feeling super excited about Neil Gaiman as an author, but I've heard so many great things about The Ocean at the End of the Lane that when I saw this illustrated version of it in a bookstore, I decided to pick it up because I was quite intrigued by the illustrations and the fact that it's just a small, light fantasy story, and I wanted to see what I thought about it. So let's get into it. First of all, let's talk about this special illustrated edition. The illustrations here are done in this black and gray. It almost looks like pencil sketches or just ink on paper. And some of the illustrations, like these couple that I'm going to show here, I thought were really quite charming and really added to the ambiance of the story that was being told. On the other hand, several of the illustrations in here just look like giant black smudges, and even with the context of the words on the page that I was reading, I couldn't tell what they were supposed to be. So yeah, some of them are just these big blobby illustrations that I'm not exactly sure what they are supposed to be representing. And so it was certainly a very mixed bag here of kind of charming, sometimes creepy and scary, sometimes just outright bizarre and unrecognizable. So I guess that was a little bit disappointing. I was hoping it would be a little bit better overall in terms of the illustrations and how they added to the story. So that's just the special edition here. Let's talk about what this book is even about. Just very briefly, from a plot perspective, we are following a man who is reminiscing about his childhood. And at some point when he's very young, around 7 or 8-ish years of age, if I recall correctly, his family dynamic is kind of upset by the arrival of this person who is more than she seems to be. In fact, this person turns out to be a kind of supernatural monster, and in seeking out help from his neighbors, this young boy discovers that some of his neighbors have this connection with a world that is kind of outside of our everyday experience. This kind of way of living that is attuned to magic and this world that kind of lies beyond the experience of most normal people. So in that manner, if you saw my video about the book The Starless Sea, you'll certainly see some similarities where you have people living in a modern day regular world who get drawn into this kind of supernatural fantasy experience. It covers themes of childhood experiences and memories and trying to make sense of a world that often doesn't make sense. But in terms of the book itself, the story that was being told, let's get the unpleasantness out of the way right off the bat. There was one scene that was very hard for me to handle. I'm somebody who grew up in an environment where I was very much abused as a child, where violence was a part of my way of life as a young kid, and where fear and anxiety were just an ever-present part of my experience growing up. And The Ocean at the End of the Lane has one really disturbing scene of violence towards a child by a caregiver that really was hard for me to handle, and I'm really feeling myself kind of moving into the PTSD mode even just thinking about it. So that was pretty rough. That being said, though, there were some things about even the negative aspects of the experiences of the children, there were some things that I could relate to besides that particular experience. Here's the first example. Chapter 2 begins by saying, "I was not happy as a child, although from time to time I was content. I lived in books more than I lived anywhere else." And that could have been written about me for sure. Building on that idea, "I'd lay on the bed and lost myself in the stories. I liked that. Books were safer than other people anyway." And yep, as a kid I lived in books. I was a huge bookworm, and that's where I kind of found my escapism and my happiness, if you can call it that. Now, the book contrasts the experiences of childhood to those of being a grown-up. So here, by contrast, are a couple of quotes about adulthood. "Ursula Monckton smiled, and the lightnings wreathed and writhed about her. She was power incarnate, standing in the crackling air. She was the storm. She was the lightning. She was the adult world with all its power and all its secrets and all its foolish, casual cruelty." Yeah, that's a perspective that I relate to again. On the other hand, it says this as well. "I said, people should be scared of Ursula Monckton." Perhaps. What do you think Ursula Monckton is scared of? Don't know. Why do you think she's scared of anything? She's a grown-up, isn't she? Grown-ups and monsters aren't scared of things. "Oh, monsters are scared," said Letty. And as for grown-ups, she stopped talking, rubbed her freckled nose with a finger. Then, "I'm going to tell you something important. Grown-ups don't look like grown-ups on the inside either. Outside, they're big and thoughtless, and they always know what they're doing. Inside, they look just like they always have, like they did when they were your age. The truth is, there aren't any grown-ups, not one in the whole wide world." I thought that was an interesting statement that is true of a lot of adults that I've interacted with over the years, where people seem to sort of end their emotional development at around the high school age, and as an adult don't seem to progress past that. And that could have very well been the same situation for me had I not gotten into the profession that I got into. When I became a paramedic, I was really forced to grow up quickly and to develop very important skill sets for dealing with life and death and outrageous situations and all kinds of emergencies. And those experiences really helped me to leave my childhood behind in a certain sense. But yeah, you don't have to go farther than the internet to find people whose emotional maturity levels aren't greater than those of a teenager. Here are a couple of more statements about adulthood and the things that are important to adults. "It was time, I knew, to drive to my sister's bustling, cheerful house, all tidied and stiff for the day. I would talk to people whose existence I had forgotten years before, and they would ask me about my marriage, failed a decade ago, a relationship that had slowly frayed until eventually, as they always seemed to, it broke, and whether I was seeing anyone. I wasn't. I was not even sure that I could. Not yet." And it goes on, and again, hits a little bit close to home there. And then, what's the most important thing to adults? This time a monstrous creature is speaking, and it says, "I am growing tired of this," said the gray thing with a petulant shake of its ragged cloth arms. "Something came to me and pleaded for love and help. It told me how I could make all the things like it happy, that they are simple creatures, and all any of them want is money, just money and nothing more. Little tokens of work. If it had asked, I would have given them wisdom or peace, perfect peace." And then that thought is carried on a bit later. "I said, who are you really? Why are you giving people money?" "Everybody wants money," she said, as if it were self-evident. "It makes them happy. It will make you happy if you let it." Of course, it becomes clear that it doesn't necessarily bring happiness. Now that we've gotten the kind of rough stuff out of the way, there were some things that made me smile too. Here are a couple of quick examples. "The kitten followed us up the stairs in a sequence of bounces. It made me smile." That just little sentence that had nothing to do with anything just put me in a warm place of sitting in front of my computer watching videos of these cat rescue channels that take in pregnant cats and newborns and take care of these kittens, and they just have these live cameras on these kittens as they are born and eventually wean and go out and get adopted. And it's just something that I watch on a daily basis to calm my own mind, to kind of ease the PTSD anxiety. And as soon as it mentioned the kitten walking these little bounces, I immediately pictured all these kittens that I watch on a daily basis, and it just made me kind of smile a bit too. This other thing was another sentence that had nothing to do with anything. It was just plopped down there in the middle of the story. It said, "We picked some pea pods, opened them, and ate the peas inside. Peas baffled me. I could not understand why grown-ups would take things that tasted so good raw and put them in tins and make them revolting." And then it just goes on to continue talking about the story. Now, speaking of stories, if you recall from watching that previous video about The Starless Sea, that book had a lot to say about stories and how stories are change, and change is what makes a story. And The Ocean at the End of the Lane seems to concur with that premise. Towards the end of the book, it says, "A story only matters, I suspect, to the extent that the people in the story change." So yeah, that would very much agree with the premise of The Starless Sea. Before I go on, I just want to take a real quick few seconds to send out a big thank you to my Patreon supporters, especially to my higher tier supporters, Joanna, Paul, Asmondas Purvect. Gosh, do I ever appreciate you. And if you want to flip me just a couple bucks a month, go to Patreon and check out Josh Yaks. Every little gift is something that is very meaningful to me and appreciated. But on with the book now. Before I talk about my rating and what I thought overall about this book, one interesting note was that the acknowledgements right at the very end, after the book was finished, are signed by Gaiman in the Isle of Skye in July 2012. I was like, no way, I've been there. I have relatives who live in Portree in the Isle of Skye, and I've been there to visit them. So I thought, oh, that's kind of interesting. Doesn't have anything to do with anything, but just gave me some warm memories of traveling around Scotland visiting distant relatives when I was in my 20s. But anyways, what did I think about The Ocean at the End of the Lane? Like I said, it was a story that was a little rough for me to handle personally because of my own childhood experiences. So even though the story was written in a very light and approachable way, and when I was just starting out in the book, I was wondering if I could read it to my kids because it was just this little illustrated book and it was a quick fantasy story. But as I got into it, I realized, no, this is not a kid's book at all. We're covering some kind of disturbing issues in here. And it wasn't really the enjoyable light fantasy experience I was hoping it would be. It was interesting in its own right. It certainly had its positive moments, but at the end of the day, on my 1 to 10 scale, I give it a 5.5 out of 10, which puts it halfway between okay and good. I say that with all due respect to Bookish Chaz, who I think claims this is his #1 favorite book of all time, and who's a huge Neil Gaiman fan. So don't just take my word on this book. I'm gonna link one of Chaz's videos below so that you can check out a completely different perspective from somebody who absolutely adores the book and seems to be in line with the majority of people who really do enjoy The Ocean at the End of the Lane much more than I did. I'm pretty sure I'm in a small minority of people in thinking that it was just okay. So like I said, don't just take my word for it. Go check out other people's stuff too and see what they have to say. But before you do, leave a comment below. Let me know what you've been reading. Let me know what you've been enjoying. Recommend to me something you think I would enjoy more. I'd love to hear from you, and I do appreciate you watching this. Thanks. Hey, it's Josh. Thank you so much for watching. If you could caress that subscribe button, if you could reach out and touch that like button, if you could share the love of this video with someone who you think would enjoy it, I would really appreciate that. Cheers. So overall, I wasn't feeling particularly fair that when I saw in a bookstore that's just the edition, as they seem always to do, as they always seem to, is The Ocean. Or do I? As I stand here and think, as I think it over just now, I'm like, I don't know. Anyhow, I'm not going to start getting into all that.